So, good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Gavin Colvert, and I'm the head of school here at Stella Maris Academy. And it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to the third of three conversations about the integrated classical advantage. We really mean for this to be a conversation, and we'd love for you to be a part of that. If you'd like to comment on our YouTube channel or our Facebook event, those comments will be relayed to me at the end of the talk, and we'll try to respond to some of them. So the theme that I'm going to be talking about this evening is forming character, inspiring the moral imagination. And I want to say at the beginning of my remarks that this isn't a talk for kids. It's a family-friendly talk, of course, but if I wanted to give a talk for kids, I'd be reading great literature with them rather than talking about great stories. So we want to talk about how stories have a crucial role in forming the character through the moral imagination of our children this evening. And in order to do that, what I'd like to do is begin with three framing questions. We know that everybody loves a good story, but the question is, why are stories, especially good stories, centrally important in children's development? A second question, we know that character counts, but what is character, and why must we help to form it as educators and as parents? And then a third question, what is the moral imagination, and what is its role in shaping and informing our character? There's a slightly related question to this. How is the moral imagination critical to inspiring resilience in children? In our contemporary educational culture, we often talk about social and emotional learning. In classical education, we use the terms character and virtue to talk about those similar subjects. So in talking about forming character and inspiring the moral imagination, we're talking about developing the emotional intelligence of our kids. So I'd like to begin by framing a biblical logos for us, right? The Word of God helps us to understand what we're doing as classical educators. And it seems that there's a paradox when you pick up the scriptures. First is from Proverbs. Train the young in the way they should go, and even when old, they will not swerve from it. Good advice. But then we encounter this in the Gospel of Matthew. The disciples approached Jesus and said, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" He called over a child, placed it in their midst, and said, "Amen, I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever receives one child such as this in my name receives me. And whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone hung around his neck." Firm words. Well, the texts seem to agree about something. As adults, we have a sacred duty to train children in the path of righteousness. And anyone who fails to do so is going to be held to account. That's an important responsibility. But the texts appear to disagree in that we should train children up, but then we should become like children by training ourselves down. Well, I think the key to interpreting these two texts is that they're not paradoxical at all, but the key is the virtues. Children may not possess, but they are nearer to the virtue of humility than the disciples who approached Jesus, puffed up with pride, asking, "Who's the greatest?" Question, why is that? And I think the answer lies in that being small allows us to have a different perspective. We can still look up and see that the world is bigger than us. The imagination has room for awe and for wonder. As adults, we often lose this capacity for awe and wonder. Whatever is the cry of adulthood. We need to form the imagination so that we don't lose this childlike quality. So let's talk for a few minutes about what is the moral imagination. Classical education aims to inspire the moral imagination. That's a good word because inspire literally means to breathe in like filling the lungs with air. This is a good metaphor for what we're trying to accomplish here. The imagination is a storehouse of images that allow us to grasp things in our mind cognitively. And as incarnate beings, that is bodily and spiritual, mind and body need to work together in understanding. Imagination mediates experience through sense and to the intellect. Now, what is the moral imagination? Well, the moral imagination provides a reflective basis not only for forming judgments about what is true and false and right and wrong, but also for envisioning possibilities, making creative choices, and taking action. It is our storehouse of images, not only for the way things are, but also for the way that they ought to be. The moral imagination, then, is the oxygen that fuels the energy and activity of the moral life. Why does this matter? Well, in a recent interesting book, Holly Ordway wrote The Apologetics and the Christian Imagination. She talks about the case of C.S. Lewis. Now, most of us know C.S. Lewis as the author of Christian spiritual classics like Mere Christianity for adults, and children's books like the Chronicles of Narnia. Here is C.S. Lewis dipping into his wardrobe from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Ordway notes, C.S. Lewis came to faith as an adult, and the imagination played a critical role in his conversion, as well as in his subsequent writing. In his autobiography, Ordway comments, surprised by joy, Lewis notes that as a young man, he was profoundly influenced by reading the novel Phantastes by the Christian author George MacDonald. Phantastes is a fairy tale, a story that does not mention Christ or the church or the Bible anywhere in its pages, but it is deeply imbued with the Christian worldview and conveys what Lewis called the bright shadow of what he would later recognize as holiness. As an adult, Lewis's friends Hugo Dyson and J.R.R. Tolkien helped him to see that, quote, if I met the idea of sacrifice in a pagan story, I liked it very much and was mysteriously moved by it. Now, the story of Christ is simply a true myth, a myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference, that it really happened. So it was the moral imagination that allowed Tolkien to enter into the space of religious belief. The moral imagination, then, according to Ordway, is critical to envisioning possibilities. She says, when people lack imaginative engagement with the faith, which may include a deficit of real meaning for the words and ideas that we use, or a failure to see that these ideas are important or interesting, their belief is starved. Rational argument helps to remove the stones and choking weeds from the field we seek to cultivate. But without the imagination, the soil is dry. So imagine that a world without the moral imagination is like a desert. It's missing something crucial, and we need to get those flowers to grow. Another image for this, the famous British philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe talks about religious faith and the role of envisioning. And she describes the two experiences, seeing the windows of a great medieval cathedral from the outside and from the inside. From the outside, they're dull. They don't convey anything. They're just dark. But when you go inside the cathedral, you see images, you see narratives, you see stories. Your imagination is inspired by those things. And this is what Elizabeth Anscombe describes is needed in order for us to enter into rational argument about religious belief. We need to see the cathedral from the inside in order to imagine the possibilities. So is there truth in imagination? Well, Ordway says, in our modern culture, imagination tends to be associated with things that are imaginary. Many people consider the imagination to be a fanciful extra at best, or a dangerous source of lies. This is a sadly impoverished and limited view of the imagination, Ordway tells us. For Aristotle and for other medieval scholars and theologians, she comments, the imagination has a cognitive function. Imagination is the human faculty that assimilates sensory data into images upon which the intellect can act. It is the basis of all reasoned thought. What about science? Does the imagination play a role in science as well? Well, the British academic Owen Barfield wrote, "The mind is never aware of an idea until the imagination has been at work on the bare material given by the senses. Not even science is exempt from the necessity of imagination because the intellect cannot deal directly with raw perceptions of the world." Here's an example for us to consider. Consider for a moment a radiologist and an untrained person looking at X-ray data. One sees only black dots on a white background. The other, on the other hand, sees calcifications that indicate a cancerous growth. They see the same thing, but they interact with the data very differently. The radiologist sees more through a conceptual and imaginative framework. But this is not mere fiction, and it is very consequential. The great moral philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre, in his seminal book After Virtue, describes a similar situation with our use of moral language and culture. By depriving our moral language and practice of the ideals of character virtue, which a classical education cultivates, MacIntyre argues, we have impoverished our ability to envision moral excellence and pursue it. It's like looking at the X-ray, but not really seeing what's there. So let's talk a little bit then about forming character, because that's the other key piece of this puzzle, before we get to talking about some good stories. What is character, and why must we as adults, as educators, as parents help to form it? Well, I think a way of getting at that is to talk about what are some of the important misconceptions about character. Many contemporary educators and parents often treat child rearing today as an exercise in fostering individual self-expression. Of course, we want kids to grow into their freedom, to be their own persons, but this is not what's going on here. They falsely assume that character does not need to be formed in light of objective standards of truth, goodness, and beauty. For them, growing up is largely just an act of self-creation. In so doing, they neglect the formation of character and the moral imagination. This is a point that is discussed effectively in Dr. Gavin Colvert's recent book, Tending the Heart of Virtue, How Classic Stories Awaken a Child's Moral Imagination. If you're a parent wanting to enter into this exercise of helping to educate your children, I would look very carefully at Gavin Colvert's book. He talks about specific stories and great examples. It's really a very illuminating text. Just some thoughts from his work. In Tending the Heart of Virtue, he says, mostly we fall back on the excuse that we are respecting our children's freedom by permitting them to determine right and wrong and to choose for themselves clear goals of moral living. But this pays misdirected tribute to a deeply flawed notion of individual autonomy. We end up forfeiting our parental authority and failing to be mentors to our children in the moral life. How does this occur? Well, cultural and moral relativism end up replacing objective standards of goodness and justice with emotive or pragmatic conceptions of satisfaction and personal preference. This is what we expose kids to in a lot of contemporary education. This leads to a problem that the great author C.S. Lewis has described as men without chess. Lewis comments, "We continue to want and expect our children to grow up to be good people. While we clamor for those very qualities of character and virtue in our children, we are rendering them impossible. We make men without chess and expect of them virtue." So what is the classical alternative? Well, let's take a look at Aristotle's Ethics. Of course, this is an ancient book. It's from 340 BC or so. But Aristotle is a very clear writer, and he has some very common sense observations about the formation of character, virtue, and vice. First, I think it's important to say, Aristotle tells us moral character is not innate. It's acquired by practice. He notes, none of the virtues of character arises in us naturally. For if something is by nature in one condition, habituation cannot bring it into another condition, practice. If something arises in us by nature, we first have the capacity for it, and we later perform the activity. Virtues, on the other hand, we acquire like crafts. We learn a craft by producing the same product that we must produce when we have learned it. You make pots by practicing forming pots. Well, you become just by doing just actions, and you become temperate by practicing temperance, and you become brave by cultivating bravery. A second thought, character is not merely subjective, although it's not identical the way it manifests itself in each person. Habits that we form make for good and bad living. Aristotle again, the sources and means that develop each virtue ruin it, just as they do in craft. Playing the harp can make both a good and a bad harpist. Otherwise, no teacher would be needed, but everyone would be born a good or bad craftsman. Notice Aristotle's idea that character can be shaped for well or ill, and the choices that we make as parents and educators have a profound effect on that. What we do in our dealings with other people makes some of us just, some of us unjust, and the habits of fear or confidence that we acquire make some of us brave and others cowardly. It is important to acquire one sort of habit or another right from youth. So character is not subjective, and habits are formed, and they need to be formed well. Third, good character requires knowledge and skill. One might suppose Aristotle says that if we do grammatical or musical actions, then we're grammarians and musicians. And similarly, if we happen to do something just or temperate actions, we're thereby just or temperate. But surely actions are not enough, Aristotle says, even in the case of crafts. For it is possible to produce a grammatical result by chance or by following someone else's instructions. Aristotle's point is that we need to act out of character, and we need to have an understanding of what we're doing, right? Good choices are not accidental. Moral character, then, is analogous but not reducible to skill in dancing, a great musical performance, and great writing, for example. While there are many genres of dance, music, and literature that are beautiful, good, and true, the habits we practice and acquire make for good or bad performances. Great skill lies not in a single performance, but in the ability to perform these things when we choose or at will. And the best teachers show us great models, images, and they help us to form good habits. They don't give us recipes. And this is crucially where the moral imagination comes in. So some key takeaways. We acquire the virtues by practicing acts that induce dispositions or habits. For example, if you want to be a great three-point shooter or play the violin spontaneously and beautifully, you need to practice. There are academic models of the moral virtues that we teach in a classical curriculum. The willingness to risk failure, the ability to collaborate with other people, being truthful in the way that we speak to other people, being kind and being respectful. These are things that we practice in school, but they illuminate our whole lives and the choices that we make. And finally, great stories provide fuel for the imagination, which in turn provides a foundation for the practice and development of character. All right, let's turn to some examples. And I think the best way to illustrate how this technique of inspiring the moral imagination works which is used at all levels in the classical curriculum, is to provide examples from great stories. As C.S. Lewis observed, great stories for children are great when they can be enjoyed by children of all ages. And I think Tolkien's classic, The Lord of the Rings, is just such a story, especially for older children. But I have to give you a warning. In order for the image that I'm about to use to inspire your imagination, you must already possess the story, which is one reason why we need to read great stories with children. So consider Samwise Gamgee, Frodo's loyal companion, on the long and dangerous quest to take the Ring of Power back to Mordor. At one point, when all seems nearly lost, Sam gives a remarkable speech about great stories. Let's listen in and make some observations. Sam says, "It's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were, and sometimes you didn't want to know the end, because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad had happened. Notice how this image, if you know the story, mirrors our present condition in the middle of a pandemic. Have you asked yourself in one moment or other, how is this affecting my children? How do I provide them with the resilience to move forward? And how will I give them the tools to encounter and overcome the struggles that they'll face in life? That's exactly what Samwise is facing. Of course, we're all looking for answers, but the answers to these questions are not to be found in a recipe, a how-to manual, or even an app for the modern life. They require us to reach into our experience and envision our future choice as parents. More fundamentally, our children need resources that inspire their response to struggle. Children can be anxious and uncertain, especially when they don't have a reference point through lack of experience. This is where stories come in. For Sam and for Tolkien, stories fill the imagination with possibilities, which are not simple recipes or prescriptions, but are metaphors that inspire understanding and choice and our actions. Let's consider Tolkien's narrative and Samwise's response. What does he say? Samwise says, "But in the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come, and when the sun shines, it will shine out the clearer." Tolkien has a special word for the sudden joyful turn of events that Samwise is describing here as typical of a great story. His word is eucatastrophe. Tolkien contrasts this turn of events with tragedy that is typical of dramatic forms. From a wonderful lecture that he gave and was eventually published as a book on fairy stories, Tolkien says, eucatastrophe is the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly, of the good catastrophe. It is a sudden and miraculous grace. It denies universal final defeat, and insofar is evangelium, good news, joy beyond the walls of the world. I think Tolkien's point here is simple but very important. Fantasy speaks a truth about the human condition, that there is reason for hope in times of struggle. If we are to overcome struggle, we need to be able to see our way through to the other side. And that's what Sam and Frodo have to do in order to complete their quest. So Sam says, folk in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't. They kept going because they were holding on to something. That there's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for. As parents, we know the general shape of the answer we must give to the question of our children's education for the future. They need resilience. They need the capacity to take risks, to pick themselves up from failure, and to attain the goal of their quest. Like hobbits, they need their lembas bread for the journey to sustain them, including the stuff of the imagination and a good worth fighting for. The good life requires a goal or purpose, that is worthy of our love, something that commands our respect, rather than that we merely invest with respect. It has to be bigger than us mere hobbits. Sam talks about this. Those were the stories that stayed with you, he says, that meant something, even if you were too small to understand why. But I think, Mr. Frodo, I do understand. I know now. Consider the alternative from Shakespeare. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Not a happy thought from Macbeth. This reminds me of a toy that I had when I was a kid. It's called the Odyssey 2000, and I'll date myself now as being a old guy in techno. But this is one of the first video games that was ever invented, and it had a wonderful feature to it, and that was what's called training mode. So it had 3 games. It played hockey, it played tennis, and it played handball, and it had 3 speeds, slow, medium, and fast. But it also had this training mode where if you happened to miss the ball as it came over the net, it just went off one side of the screen and came back to the other. Well, that's great. You could be in training mode all your life, but you'd never accomplish anything. Another image for this. I think depriving children of great stories and inspiring their moral imagination is like placing them on a football field with all of the same rules, but no goalposts. Nothing to envision, to aim for. That's really frustrating. This is what classical education aims to correct. Now, life could just be a tale told by an idiot without any significance. We do need to consider this possibility as mature adults. But if we cannot envision any alternative, consideration of this will be futile. And by the way, if this premise is false, as many thoughtful minds have concluded, we need great stories that speak to this truth about the world to our children so that they'll be able to take on the challenges they face. I have another example, and this one's for younger kids. Let us consider another example of how stories can inspire the moral imagination, even about deeply important and complicated human questions. Prepare yourself, back up, I'm going to throw something heavy on you, so here we go. The law of the gift. St. John Paul II, I think, tells us a very deep truth about human life, and it's in this passage. Spousal love contains a deep paradox, he says. In the order of nature, the person is disposed to perfecting himself. The fullest and most radical form of love consists precisely in the fact of giving oneself. The paradox in this case is twofold. First, that one can go out of one's own I in this way. And second, that by doing so, this I is not in the least destroyed or devalued, but on the contrary, is developed and enriched. Well, that's pretty heavy, but what I would say to you, it is a complicated but life-altering truth, and some people never grasp it. The deepest truth about human life is that we find personal fulfillment in relationship and communion with other human beings and with God. To a Christian who deeply understands that God is love and that we are made in God's image and likeness, well, this makes sense and it's easily understood. But how can we begin to convey this to our children? Well, surely not as a series of propositions or statements in a philosophy class, for example, or a theology class, but a child can experience the animating power of love. Consider the story The Velveteen Rabbit by Marjorie Williams, another great story written in 1922. Now, in this delightful story, we're introduced to a stuffed animal, a rabbit who desires to be real. In the course of the story, the rabbit learns the meaning of life, and perhaps even of eternal life. Here's Rabbit. "What is real?" asked the rabbit one day. "Does it mean having things that buzz inside you and a stick-out handle?" "Real isn't how you're made," said the skin horse. "It's a thing that happens to you. When a child loves you for a long time, not just to play with, but really loves you, then you become real." "Does it hurt?" asked the rabbit. "Sometimes," said the skin horse, for he was always truthful. "When you're real, you don't mind being hurt." Now, children experience love in the first place from within the family. The attention that they receive excites and it animates them. The more we love them, the more they come alive. Marjorie Williams' genius is to help children see that they have that life-giving power within them, that mere inanimate objects don't possess that power, that it is an organic and not a mechanical thing, and that in giving love, that we will be fulfilled in return. Of course, there's much more to learn about growing up, about the reality of suffering, about wisdom, about old age, about whether people or things are important in life, and perhaps about the place of the technological. The skin horse had lived longer in the nursery than any of the others. He was so old that his brown coat was bald in patches. He was wise, for he had seen a long succession of mechanical toys arrive to boast and swagger, and by break their mainsprings and pass away. And he knew that they were only toys and would never turn into anything else. Children learn that to become real, to be fully human, that life is a long process, that there are bumps along the road and there's suffering, but that the goal cannot be attained without struggle, flexibility, and perseverance. It doesn't happen all at once, said the skin horse. You become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't happen often to people who break easily, or have sharp edges, or have to be carefully kept. We know about that as adults, right? Generally, by the time you're real, most of your hair has been loved off and your eyes drop out and you get loose in the joints. Perhaps a little arthritis and very shabby. But these things don't matter at all, because once you're real, you can't be ugly, except to people who don't understand. In all of this, we need to remember that the moral imagination is not a series of conclusions or a set of propositions. It provides a framework within which understanding, choice, and action have the inspiration to operate. And we do an injustice to great stories if we expect them to be merely instructive. A story is a way to say something that can't be said any other way, says Flannery O'Connor, and it takes every word in the story to say what the meaning is. You tell a story because a statement would be inadequate. When anybody asks what a story is about, the only proper thing is to tell them to read the story. So what is our key takeaway from all of this? The concept of the moral imagination can be applied to stories across all ages, from the Velveteen Rabbit to the Lord of the Rings and beyond. We started with 3 questions. Why are stories, especially good stories, centrally important in children's development? What is character, and why must we as adults, educators, and parents help to form it? And finally, what is the moral imagination? What is its role in shaping and informing character? Here are some thoughts. Character enables children to envision and guide their choices to achieve excellence in life. The moral imagination fuels the formation of character, especially for the young. And we build up the moral imagination by sharing great stories with children. Emphasis there on with. We must enter into and share those stories with them. So, this conversation this evening has been about the integrated classical advantage. What does a classical education offer to you and to your family? It offers many things. It offers the richness of faith, as Father talked about in his initial talk. And as Greg Meck talked about in his talk, it helps us to fulfill the true promise of STEM, to be really prepared to ask deep questions and get great scientific answers. Well, another key to the integrated classical advantage is the emphasis on reading great stories and inspiring the moral imagination. So we want to thank you for joining us this evening. We want this to be a conversation. If you have some questions, I'd be happy to try and take them now. But you can always reach out to us here at Stella Maris Academy for more information about our school programs. Remember, please, to like our Facebook page and also to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you like the things that you're seeing here, we'll be doing more of these things in the future. So thank you all for joining us. God bless you.
Thank you, Dr. Colvert. We have a couple questions here for you. So first, the great books seem addressed somewhat to older kids. How do you apply this to younger kids like kindergartners?
Okay, well, I think that there are great books and there are great stories and good books and good stories. And what I've tried to illustrate in the talk, and I would suggest that people look at our curriculum overview and see that what we're doing with children is we're trying to convey the ideas that the great adult literature gives us, but in a way which is approachable and understandable to young kids. And I think the interesting thing, my experience of seeing kids who've had a classical education, is it's amazing how far they can go. You could sit down and talk about the law of the gift with kids in 3rd or 4th grade, and they would be able to understand that from reading the great stories that we're talking about reading with them. You don't have to tell them, okay, well, let's read Aristotle's Ethics and, here's chapter 2. But what you have to do is talk about the ideas and the concepts.
All right, another one. I heard in the other talks a lot of talk about the integrated classical.
Yeah.
Do we develop the moral imagination in an integrated way across different disciplines?
Of course, that's an excellent question. We talk about integrating the disciplines horizontally and vertically. So horizontally, we come as children, we come as whole persons. We have questions about the world, and those questions have a mathematical dimension, they have an historical dimension, they have a sociological dimension, they have a faith dimension. And we don't unpack them into little pockets like that. So while we teach different subjects in a classical school, what we want is an openness for children to be able to see the connections between the different subjects that they're learning. And so surely there's room to inspire the moral imagination in a science class, for example, where you learn about great scientists. Some of them are behind me, and you see what they were able to do, right? What kinds of problems they faced and challenges they faced, right? So great stories are things that are not just in children's literature, but they're in everything that we read and encounter in the curriculum. Then the last thing I would say is we want the curriculum to be integrated not only horizontally, but vertically. And that is where theology and the active life of the faith, the liturgy and the practice of the faith is crucially important because it gives the context which helps to make sense of the world as a whole for our kids. So the resilience that they're going to gain from reading great stories gets worked out in a liturgical context.
One more question, unless others come in. I know that your curriculum talks about character development being closely integrated with emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
How does the forming of the moral imagination relate to the emotional intelligence?
Well, that's a great question. It's a complex question. I won't do justice to it here, but the moral imagination, as we said, provides images. And in the tradition, we understand those images as providing, as I said, the oxygen or fuel for the moral life. And each of the virtues cultivates different aspects of our character, the ability to think, the ability to feel, the ability to love. And so what the moral imagination does is it inspires all those activities, those intellectual activities of thinking, of knowing, of loving, of acting, and it makes it possible for kids to have the material to do that. And especially for young children who don't have the experience of life that adults have had. You know, as a parent, you often say to yourself, well, I wish I would have been able to help my child avoid that mistake that I made when I was 21, right? So the idea is that the moral imagination helps them to encounter and experience many of those things that they're going to grow up and experience, and it inspires those choices so they make the best choices from the start of life.
It's really great. Well, I think we're about out of questions. Thank you so much for walking us through all of that wonderful stuff tonight, Dr. Colvert, and thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us in the audience, and we look forward to speaking with you here at Stella Maris Academy. Give us a call, send us an email. God bless and good evening.